Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for the DeFord Lecture Series. My name is Elizabeth Catlos and I'm a faculty member in the Department of Geological Sciences at the University of Texas at Austin. We are part of the Jackson School of Geosciences, and the DeFord Lecture Series is our departmental seminar series. It's been a requirement and a tradition for all graduate students since the late 1940s. The lecture series is named after Professor Roland DeFord, who joined the university as a professor in 1948 with the purpose of enhancing the quality of the graduate program of the department. Our lecture series is supported by a range of endowments, and today's speaker is the Fred L. and Francis J. Oliver Lecturer in Texas Hydrology and Water Resources. Fred and Francis Oliver created the lectureship in 1985 because they believe the study of water resources in Texas is as important as the development and exploration of oil and gas. They established the lectureship with the goal of providing better education concerning water problems faced by Texas and the solution to those problems. Fred received his Bachelor of Science in Geology from the University of Texas at Austin in 1951. He is a current member of the Geology Foundation Advisory Council. He resides in Dallas, Texas, where he's president of PVT Inc. In 2009, Fred's family established the Fred and Francis Oliver Endowed Scholarship in their honor to recruit graduate students in the field of hydrology. Our speaker will be introduced formally by Dr. Michael Young, who is a senior research scientist at the Jackson School's Bureau of Economic Geology. Michael?
Thank you, Liz, and welcome everybody. I am really excited to introduce Dr. Asmeret Asefaw Berhe. She is a professor of soil biogeochemistry and the Folasco Chair in Earth Sciences at the Department of Life and Environmental Sciences at UC Merced. She is also serving as the Interim Associate Dean for the Graduate Division at UC Merced. Dr. Berhe earned her BS in Soil and Water Conservation from the University of Asmeret in Eritrea, her MS in Resource Development and Political Ecology from Michigan State, and her PhD in Biogeochemistry from Berkeley. She was also the UC President's postdoc fellow at UC Berkeley and UC Davis. Her research interest lies at the intersection of soil science, global change science, and political ecology, and she seeks to improve our understanding of how the soil system regulates the Earth's climate and the dynamic two-way relationship between soil and human communities. I could speak for an hour about all the great things that she's been doing. I'll just hit the highlights here. Among her many awards and honors, Dr. Berhe received the NSF's Career Award. She is a member of the inaugural class of the U.S. National Academy's New Voices in Science, Engineering, and Medicine. She's the recipient of the Bromley Award and a fellow of the Geological Society of America. She is passionate about all things soil, which you will hear, and is driven to ensure that scientific education and careers are equally accessible to people from all walks of life, and that academic workplaces are free from bias and harassment. So with a huge round of applause that we have to do from Zoom, please welcome Dr. Berhe.
Thank you so much, Michael, for that generous introduction. I really appreciate the invitation and the introduction. And I wish I was able to join you all right there in person, which I actually was telling Michael I really would like to do at some point because I've never been to Austin, but I hear all sorts of good things all the time. And I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you about the work that we do in my lab, in particular work focused on deep soil organic matter dynamics, and why I think it's really important that we should all look deeper into the soil when we're thinking about soil, carbon, water, and a whole host of other questions. Thanks again for the department for the invitation. And I'll start by telling you a little bit about the kind of work that we do in my lab. So we're a soil biogeochemistry lab, and a lot of the work that we do revolves around questions about how and why does carbon stay in soil for hundreds and thousands of years. Think about the fact that soil carbon or organic matter in general is a collection of organic compounds that we know are thermodynamically unstable, and they would decompose rather quickly if they're left on the surface of the soil. But once these organic compounds enter the soil, they tend to be capable of staying there for up to millennia and sometimes longer, partly because of the unique environmental conditions that are in soil. And so in my work in particular, I've tried to zoom into questions around what happens to this ability of soil to store organic matter and to thereby control the global climate and atmospheric concentration of greenhouse gases when the soil system experiences physical change, rather rapid physical change in the environment that could occur in the form of lateral transport of topsoil by erosion or fire and introduction of heat and combustion because of the activity of wildfires in particular, and also because of a number of global change variables that have to do with changing atmospheric temperature or even changing the amount, timing, and duration of precipitation, and thereby the influence that has on hydrologic flow regimes in soil. And in our lab, then, we tend to take a pretty what we hope is an informed approach that informed by justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion to ask these kinds of questions, to bring to the fold people from many different backgrounds to help us understand the impact of these different physical forcings in the environment on the biogeochemical cycles of carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus. Every once in a while, in particular when we're discussing fire, we zoom in a specific pool of carbon that is we call pyrogenic carbon, which just means fire-altered carbon. And I think one of the longest running themes of research in our lab has been around questions of transport. Why should we care about transport of topsoil and transport of organic matter from topsoils laterally on the landscape, as well as vertically, and even sometimes its export from terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems? A lot of the questions that we ask around persistence or long-term stability of organic matter in soil are informed by our understanding of the dynamics of reactive minerals in soil that are typically nano-sized. And at a larger scale, we then, in particular over the last decade or so, I've been engaging a lot in questions around soil security. The global population of humans, as well as every living member on land, depends on the soil system for our food needs, feed, fiber, and many other ecological needs that we have. But the soil system that we depend on has been degraded and continues to be degraded at unprecedented rates because of human action. So I've spent a lot of time thinking about this dynamic two-way relationship between soil and human communities, and the implication of soil degradation in particular on human and national security questions going forward. As you can imagine, our work covers multiple spatial and temporal scales to ask, though, these fundamental questions about how does the soil system control our climate, and how we as human community can responsibly engage with soil resources. Today, I'll focus talking about carbon accounting and dynamics in deep soil layers in particular. And I will give you 3 different case studies or examples from papers we recently published, or our papers that are in the review process, to help you think through the importance of deep soils for carbon storage, the importance when it comes to CO2 production and flux back into the atmosphere, as well as the role of management, in particular management of working lands, to improve the soil's ability to sequester atmospheric carbon dioxide and store that carbon deep in soil layers where it has a chance of staying for long periods of time. Okay, so as an intro, for those of you who are not in biogeochemistry, I should elaborate that majority of soil ecology, biogeochemistry work is conducted in topsoil, typically in the top 10 centimeters of soil. Every once in a while, it goes down to 50 centimeter or 100 centimeters depth. And the justification for this is that most of the carbon in soil, or at least the highest concentration of carbon in soil, is observed in topsoils. And topsoils also tend to be the most biologically active, and that's obviously the rooting depth where agricultural plants are exploring. So topsoil is considered the most important from an agricultural perspective. And we also know that topsoil experiences fluctuations in temperature and precipitation quite significantly, and there's a diurnal fluctuation in soil temperature and moisture dynamics that is critical, and that is way more kind of fluctuating, if you will, or the amplitudes of that fluctuation are way higher in topsoil than there are in deep soils. But I'm here to argue that that perspective is really not helpful. We need to think about the whole soil profile, including depths below 10 centimeter, definitely, but as much as possible, even below a meter. And I'll give you examples of why I think this is important. But as as I argue, though, for this whole soil profile perspective in biogeochemistry in particular, I have to start by asking a question about what exactly is deep soil? What does that mean, right? Because that means different things to different people. A lot of times in the literature, people use the designation of soil that's below 30 centimeter or even below the plow layer in agricultural systems, or maybe soil that's below the A horizon as being a representation of deep soil. But I have to be upfront at the fact that we do not have a unified definition of what exactly we mean by topsoil versus deep soil. And this is also made interesting by the fact that soils, as they weather and evolve and develop over time, the depth of A horizon, for example, change. The depth at which the weathered layers, or for example, I think I see questions coming. Oh, okay. The depth of weathering zone can vary over time. I really like this figure from a paper from a while ago now by Dan Richter and Don Markowitz, who show these four of the 12 soil orders in the US classification system to highlight basically how the depth of the A horizon, for example, changed. And definitely the depth of that whole soil profile, if you were considering A, B, and C horizons, considerably changed over time, right? As soils weather from parent material, this, increasing thickness of soil is one of the most important consequences of weathering, right? So over time, soil depth varies. Spatially around the world, soil depth varies significantly, even along hill slopes. Soil depth varies along, soil depth systematically basically varies across climatic zones, across areas that have different biological communities or biotic influences. It varies systematically across topographic gradients. It even varies systematically around the time, along time axis, as you see in this figure. So it's important to keep this perspective in mind as we're talking about deep soil and the contribution of deep soil to soil carbon dynamics or other biogeochemical cycles, because that will vary spatially at different ecosystems. And one of the ways you could see this is that these are kind of just three demonstrations of how pedogenic or soil processes control soil depth. The examples that I'm showing you are all fairly deep soils, definitely more than 10, 50, or even a meter depth, as you could see by the human scales that are in this picture. This first figure, a picture on the left, is Anona. She's a former student of my colleague Erica Marin Spiota, and she is standing next to an aeolian deposit, a very popular paleosoil called Brady soil in Nebraska. This entire depth that you see here is a less or windblown material that was deposited in Nebraska over 10,000 years ago. And you can even see clear evidence of the material that was transported about 10,000 years ago, having a lot more organic matters. Even the color is different, as you can see it. And that whole depth here extends to about 6 meters. In other parts of the state, the less deposit can extend way past 30 centimeters and even 50 meters, way past 30 meters, and in some cases close to 50 meters at depth. So clearly, if we were just talking about the top meter in this kind of ecosystem, we miss a pretty big part of the story. This is the site of one of our study sites in the Southern Sierra Nevada. This is my student, Morgan Barnes. And in this particular location, the depth of the weathered soil extends all the way down to close to 10 meters below the soil surface. The top 2.5 or so meters max is what we typically recognize as A and B horizon. Below that, these soils have a very thick fractured weathered bedrock that's granitic in origin. And I'm going to talk to you about the significance of that from a carbon perspective. And of course, this is an example of a tropical altisol or oxisol as a transition, if you will, to show these highly weathered soil enriched in iron oxides. And that is really, really deep in which is common in tropical, wet, humid tropical systems. Okay, so having deep soils is one thing. The other thing you want to think about it is, okay, so how does carbon make it into these deep layers, right? One of the most effective ways for introducing carbon into deep soils is through roots. Typically, obviously, agricultural plants tend to have fairly shallow roots, in particular annuals, but many other types of plants, including trees, have deep-rooted, extensive rooting systems that extend way below 1 meter. In the Sierra Nevada system that we work in, for example, there's evidence of roots exploring below 6 meters in the fractured bedrock. So carbon can definitely make it, either when the biomass of roots die and they, they are stored there, or even from exudates that these roots release. There's also a lot of evidence out there for biotubation or physical mixing of soil by activity of burrowing mammals, for example, that can redistribute vertically carbon from the topsoil into deep soil layers. And this is really important wherever you have significant activity of biotubation by burrowing mammals, by tree roots, and whatever the mixing agent might be. There's also significant evidence across many different types of ecosystems that when water moves down the soil profile, it dissolves water extractable or dissolvable organic compounds, and it redistributes them down the soil profile. Wherever water can access, carbon can be found in, right? These two are evidences from France and Hawaii that you could see these clear evidence of not just water moving in, but even the color across those tones, demonstrating that it's taking organic matter down with it. We also know, even from basic pedology, that cryotubation or frost churning that typically occurs in cold environments is also very capable of moving. So what you see here is the A horizon that's, kind of in this frost churned ecosystem being basically turned in and is now found below a B horizon because of frost churning or cryotubation. And there's a really wonderful review on how burial of transported material can also store large amounts of soil and carbon in different types of depositional settings, in volcanic environments, in environments where you found wind-blown or less deposits, in particular when you have paleosols or buried soils that are affected, obviously, by burial of topsoil material that was transported by wind. And the last figure here is topsoil material that is transported and deposited by the activity of water in all sorts of alluvial systems. So all of these are, I think, mechanisms that we've known about for long periods of how deep soil can have interesting or at least important contributions from soil development perspective as well as carbon dynamics. There's been a few works here and there that have been showing that deep soil, in particular soil below the A horizon or 30 centimeters, can constitute at least half of the soil's carbon stock, soil carbon stock. And there's been different isotopic and other tracer studies that have shown that most of this carbon is derived from below ground input, not above ground material that's being routed, but rather input from roots, again, from root biomass or exudates that are released from roots. And once carbon makes it into these deep layers, we know that it can persist there for long, long periods of time, way longer than it can in near surface layers. And all of these figures on your right, the lines are from multiple studies that have documented 40C age, or which is a proxy of mean residence time or persistence of carbon in soil. So, we've seen this in previous studies, and we've also documented this in this paper. This Tian et al. Paper is one that is in review right now from our group. And then we've also seen discussions and data come out and recently in the literature that this tons of carbon that we're recognizing is stored in deep soil layers may actually be sensitive to changes in climate. So if that deep soil does experience warming or it sees change in amount of water that's flowing through that soil, that it can destabilize some of this carbon that's stored in deep soil layers. And in fact, there's been some studies that had alluded to this, of which are both about 10 years, if not more, older at this point, that the efflux of CO2 from deep soil layers, now we're talking about below 30 centimeters or below A horizon, can actually be an important component of the surface CO2 fluxes that we measure using chambers or other approaches. So pretty important. So with all that armed with all that information, we wanted to understand, okay, so if we were to look at the entire soil profile, and I mean the entire soil profile all the way down to bedrock contacts, how much carbon are we likely to find in deep soil layers? And we wanted to ask this question across ecosystems that vary in the type of soil that they support. And we found a wonderful location for the study on the western slope of the Sierra Nevada, the location of the Southern Sierra Critical Zone Observatory, which was located again along the elevation sequence on the western slopes, which is a well-characterized, well-studied climal sequence where the soils around the elevation sequence vary significantly. You start from entosols, go all the way out all to alpha soils, well-weathered soils, basically largely driven by variability in climate. So the lowest elevation site, weathering and plant productivity is limited by hot temperatures and dry climates, if you will, dry precipitation or low precipitation. But as you go up in elevation, temperature drops, precipitation increases. And when you get to, about Providence, then you get to a point where rainfall starts to be a lesser proportion of the total precipitation. So high elevation systems have a significant contribution of snow instead of just rainfall. And so there's important differences in climate. And then we've known from many studies, including seminal ones that by people like Hans Jenny, starting from the 1940s, that have shown that the soil depth varies systematically along these sequence. The amount of carbon stored in these soils varies along the sequence, but a lot of it was based on observations of the A and the B horizon. So thankfully, working as part of the team of the Southern Sierra CZO, and with wonderful students that you see in this picture, Kimber Moreland and Morgan Barnes, and in collaboration with researchers at UC Davis, Toby Eugene's lab in particular, we started asking these questions about whole soil carbon accounting. And we were fortunate enough to be part of a geoprobe effort where there was this effort to drill the ridge, as it was known in the CZO world, to characterize the deep subsurface. And so we were able to collect samples across these sites all the way down to bedrock contact. And the figure, the bar chart that you see on your right, is a demonstration of how deep the soils are and their diagnostic horizons across these sequences. So as you go from low to high elevation, then at least until you reach Providence, climate becomes more and more favorable for weathering. So you see development of thick A and B horizons, but also a very deep weathered bedrock. And it was really interesting for us because we know that weathered bedrock had not really been previously included in our accounting of carbon. So we set out to look into the carbon that is associated with this deep weathered bedrock and how significant it is in the larger scheme of things. I should show you first that if you measure the amount of carbon that's stored in soil across this entire depth gradient across the whole climal sequence, you see a predictable pattern where the percent carbon drops significantly, in particular past 1 meters, right? But you still have, at maximum situations in the mixed conifer forest, you still have another 9 meters of depth to work with. So even though the concentration drops significantly, the amount of carbon overall stays significant. In fact, when I plot that instead of on basis of carbon percent, but rather on the inventory of carbon to account for how much carbon's actually there after I factor in bulk density and everything else, I see an interesting pattern. So now what you have is I've separated the carbon inventory in the soil, which you remember we had put the soil as the A, B, and the C horizon, and the weathered bedrock is now one that I'm presenting by itself. So the CR layer, which I said was not really characterized before. So you go again along the elevation sequence, the amount of carbon stored in soil increases all the way down, all the way up to the mixed conifer ecosystem where there are the deepest soils. And in areas that have deep weathered bedrock, the deep weathered bedrock actually becomes a very significant part of the story. And remember, this deep weathered bedrock we're talking about in these cases is way below 2 meters below the soil surface. This is something that we did not even include. We don't typically include in our typical accounting of carbon storage in soil, right? And so when you factor in the total carbon, which is represented by these pie charts then, and look at the proportion of carbon in weathered bedrock compared to the whole, you see that this pool of carbon that we did not previously include in our accounting can be up to 30% of the total carbon. Even in low elevation systems that don't have a significant depth of weathered bedrock, like the low elevation site, it could still be close to 9% of the total carbon inventory, which is important. And we looked at relationship of a range of different climate variables and see which ones explain a significant proportion of the variability in carbon storage in this site. And we see that mean annual precipitation, and in particular, deep water percolation, which is this variable that we use, which is basically annual precipitation minus evapotranspiration, tend to be the most important predictor variables as far as climate is concerned to explain how much carbon we're seeing in weathered bedrock. And I want to take a moment. I want to take a pause here to explain that the reason why deep water percolation is important is because this is the amount of water that's actually moving down the soil profile, right? The amount of water where the soil is actually seeing, the amount of water that the roots in the deep soil are seeing, when you take out the ET part of the equation. And a big part where we think this is playing a role is in the role that water plays in weathering and increasing soil thickness in the first place. So when there is a lot of weathered bedrock volume to work with, you end up with a lot more carbon that's stored in that soil. So pretty important for our sites, but we wanted to think about, okay, how important is this globally then. And we did some back of the envelope calculations, assuming, making some major assumptions about the global area that is likely to have different types of parent material. Because remember, in the Southern Sierra, we're working with granitic parent material that doesn't typically have a lot of carbon in the soil. But a lot of other types of parent materials, in particular when you have sedimentary material, shale, and other types of metamorphic rocks, they can actually have rock-derived or geogenic carbon associated with them. So when we try to make an informed assumption about the distribution of different types of parent material and the amount of carbon that they're likely to have based on our results in Southern Sierra, we find that if we assume that the areas around the world that can have deep weather bedrock on average can have something between 1 to 5 meters of depth, then that accounts for 200 petagrams of carbon. This is new carbon that basically is not accounted for in any of our global models for carbon right now. This is carbon that is not in any part of the way we account for how much carbon the soil system is taking up from the atmosphere. So 200 is a lot, right? It's close to 7% of the total global soil carbon stock that we have in our accounting right now. I should say so that because of the very rough kind of type of the calculation that we do here, I want you to remember that there's a big error bar associated with this value. And so this is the first ever, to our knowledge, approximation or estimation of the global potential of carbon storage in weathered bedrock that I know of. And so we're putting it out there, and it looks like the review process so far is going well for the community to see and help us think through these ideas and see how close are we to the accurate number. But I will say so that if this 200 number is anywhere near what is likely the amount of carbon stored in weathered bedrock, then that is huge and significant, because it's way more than what we currently characterize as the hidden soil carbon pool in some of the global carbon budgets, where we're recognizing there's a pool of carbon we're missing, we can't quite account for in our global accounting. And it's even bigger than that. So I think it's important that we nail down how accurate this estimates are as soon as possible. So I'll take a little bit of detour now and go to ask questions about the nature and stability of carbon across depth profiles. So if you look at the nature of soil organic matter along a soil profile, you're very likely to see high concentration of carbon in topsoils, and that carbon is also likely to have a big proportion that is associated with particulate organic matter, so pieces of litter and things that you can identify or are at different stages of decomposition. It's also likely to have high carbon to nitrogen ratio, reflecting the relatively fresh nature of the organic matter, which we expect that CN ratio to drop over time with the decomposition. And it's also going to have a lot of plant-derived organic functional groups such as lignin. Over time, as carbon gets associated with deep soil layers, the carbon that remains in deep soils for long periods of time tend to be enriched in microbially synthesized compounds, both sugars and lipids. And most of that carbon also tends to be bound to mineral surfaces or is associated with aggregates. So it's physically trapped inside aggregates. That's what this cartoon is showing. So the carbon is physically trapped inside aggregates, making it hard for microbes to break it down, because the aggregates make it hard for water, enzymes, and even microbes to access that carbon. Or if the carbon is associated chemically with the surfaces of minerals, then simply the microbes have to break these bonds before they can access the carbon for decomposition. But in the topsoil layers, you see evidence that this carbon is very likely free, at least a large proportion of it is free from association with minerals, and there's a big proportion of carbon that's also water extractable or dissolvable. that's less so in deep soil layers. This has many important implications, including for when we think about dissolved organic matter. One way to think about that is during low flows, times along hill slopes, for example, the water moving across, hill slopes or hydrologic systems is likely to take carbon from the topsoil with it. But during high intensity events, or even when you experience scouring of stream beds and things like that, it's likely to take more and more carbon from deeper soil layers. We also recognize that as dissolved organic carbon moves down soil profiles, that the soil particles and aggregates and the reactive surface of soil minerals in particular acts like a chromatographic column where it takes out organic compounds from solution and attach them to mineral surfaces or facilitates aggregation. But over time, there's continuous exchange that's happening between solution and mineral surfaces, and aggregates get dynamic, they get formed and they get broken down. And so as that's happening, the carbon exchange with soil solution, it's moving down the soil profile, but obviously carbon that enters that association with minerals, be it physically inside aggregates or chemical bonding to the surfaces of minerals, moves and turns over slower compared to carbon that's free and flowing down the pore spaces freely too. So we hypothesized when we started the Sierra Nevada work that there has to be differences in the activity and rate of turnover of carbon down the soil profile. And in fact, we see quite significant evidence of that. If you focus on the CN ratio initially, typically you would expect that fresh organic matter is going to have high carbon to nitrogen ratio, and over time that ratio decreases as the different constituents are preferably taken out by microbes or lost through decomposition. But what we see in the evidence, in particular, if you focus on the blue, the area that has the deepest weathered bedrock, is that this considerable fluctuation that's happening with depth, right? Suggesting that there is a mixture of more and less decomposed organic matter all the way down to the bottom of that profile. This is also reflected
transform infrared spectroscopy, in particular using this drift approach that is fairly common in soils. And here I'm presenting data on the proportion of the aromatic to aliphatic groups. So presumably speaking, aromatics such as lignin get preferentially enriched as little as
initially. We recognize that the plants, as the biomass is decomposing, the microbes preferentially decompose the simpler compounds, like the simple carbohydrates and proteins, which are aliphatic more than the harder to break down compounds such as lignin. So if the relative proportion of aromatics in the organic matter is increasing, it suggests more decomposed or more processed organic matter. So that's clearly the case in the lower elevation sites, the lower elevation sites, and that tends to be reflected, generally speaking, in the pattern with depth that we observe. But in the deepest soil and the weathered bedrock that we're looking at in the mixed conifer site, though, it remains rather low. The ratio remains rather low throughout the entire profile, in some ways mimicking the carbon to nitrogen ratio, which suggests that once carbon makes it in this layer, it seems to be preserved, and it is getting preserved for long periods of time, as you could see here with the radiocarbon data. So the radiocarbon data suggests that the carbon that's especially below 500 centimeters, so below 5 meters on the surface, is carbon that's anywhere from 7 to 20,000 years old. So this carbon that is remaining in these deep layers for so long, but relatively speaking, is less decomposed than the carbon that's actually in the lower elevation sites, for example. And the only way that's going to happen is if there's actually conditions in these deep soil layers that are not favorable for decomposition. So once carbon makes it down there with the dissolved organic matter, with roots or whatever brings it down there, it tends to remain there for long periods of time. And we see evidence in these fluctuations that newer carbon is definitely coming in and getting mixed with the old carbon, right? That's about how we, they're one of the very few ways you can see these increasing CN ratios with depth. So new carbon's coming in, diluting the pool a bit, but for the most part, once carbon makes it into deep soil layers, it tends to be preserved. But I don't want you to take away from my statement that I just made that it's preserved forever. Not really the case, right? I don't think that's realistic. It just means it's getting stabilized and its rate of decomposition is relatively slower. But if we take a step back and then think about, okay, so how much carbon is decomposing in these deep layers? And relatively speaking, how big of a number is that carbon that's coming out in gaseous form compared to the amount of carbon that is coming into the soil pool because of new production of photosynthate and introduction of new carbon into the soil pool. This is work that I've done as part of my dissertation actually many years ago that we keep going back to because this was one of the first times we've noticed this really interesting dynamics and activity of deep soils. And what you have here, just to quickly give you kind of help you think about this, is these are soils collected from an eroding hill slope. So net eroding positions in the summit and then back slope and even lower foot slope positions. And then a depositional terrestrial depression or hollow and plain. And we've did a whole lot of other work to show that these are net eroding sites, so they're fairly shallow, if you will, less soil, but the depositional site soils are deeper and they continue to get even deeper and thicker in soils. And when we do an accounting of, say, first, how much of the total carbon in these soils is found below 30 centimeter? That's the broken line that you see here. In these deep soils, close to half, if more than half actually, of the carbon is located below 30 centimeters. And then when we compare the amount of carbon that's decomposed in these deep soil layers to the amount of carbon that we know is coming into these layers from the plant production that we've done in a separate work, we notice that something like 50 to 60% of the carbon that's coming in from from plants is being offset by decomposition of deep soil carbon. And that's really significant, which suggests that deep soil carbon, in particular, if the environmental conditions are conducive to decomposition like they are in these depositional environments, can be very dynamic and can respond to changes in environmental conditions. To further probe this question, I worked with Johan Six when he was at UC Davis, and this is a project in a highly experimented site just right outside campus at UC Davis. And what you see basically is there are these three profiles, A, B, and C, that we're monitoring continuously over time, monitoring them across depth profiles going from 15 centimeters to 90 centimeters and even surface CO2 fluxes. And we monitored them for CO2, oxygen, water, temperature, and a whole host of other things that you can imagine. And we extended the measurement probes from a soil pit that's right in the middle here so that we avoid disturbing the soil profiles in the areas that we're trying to monitor. In particular, the results I'm going to show you right now are what happens when we experimentally manipulate the amount of water that the soil is seeing. So we applied drip irrigation and wetted the soil, and we waited for the soil to wet, and then we waited for the soil to dry after wetting, and we observed the CO2 flux dynamics that happen afterwards. And so the first thing you notice is that there is a lot of diurnal fluctuation of the of the CO2 concentration that occurs in the very top layer, that is more muted fluctuation as you go with depth. And then if you look at the patterns ambient, I'm cutting the ambient data fairly short because it's pretty consistent. You see this very flat trend basically across all the depth profiles over time. And this is data averaged across the 3 profiles. And then when I wet the soil, you see a spike. This is a Mediterranean ecosystem, so to an extent it's limited by water. And we notice rather quickly a response in terms of CO2 concentration of soil. Obviously, the deeper soil layers respond after the more shallow layers because they see the water a bit later. And part of the response here is also that air gets pushed down as water is moving down, right? And so we observe higher and higher rates of CO2 concentration at depth. So the wetting phase is what you expect. There's a period here where I'm leaving alone because it's when the soil is really, really wet, right? And in fact, the top 2 sensors, the soil's too wet that they don't record reliably at that level. So we've excluded that data. And then I want you to follow what happens as that soil is left to dry over a couple of weeks. And as we dry it, we see a rapid kind of return back to baseline conditions, and even matched by that diurnal fluctuations in this deep, in the shallow layers. But the deep soil layers, the high concentration of CO2 maintains all the way past this monitoring period. And one of the things that we've learned from this study, which just came out in biogeochemistry fairly recently, is that very small change in soil temperature and water content can lead to large change in the concentration of CO2 in deep soil layers. And that change actually persisted for a long period of time. And other work that we've done in this context demonstrates that that change in CO2 concentration is more related to change in the rate of decomposition and not just the transport of gases down the soil profile that I mentioned earlier. And in fact, if you calculate the relative change in CO2, so per unit change in CO2 concentration observed per unit change in temperature across these depth profiles at the 3 phases, the ambient, the wetting, and the drying phases, you start seeing very interesting deviations in the response of top versus deep soil layers to change in temperature, right? And that change in temperature, more importantly, seems to be modulated by what's going on with the water status of that soil. So not only is the soil CO2 production sensitive to temperature, then it's also sensitive to how the temperature changes are coupled to whether that soil is experiencing wetting and drying. And very important again to highlight that these changes tend to be related to rate change in CO2 production that happen at these different environmental conditions. So I think what we've demonstrated is that deep soil can be considerably more sensitive to change in environmental conditions, even in some cases more than near surface soil could be. We're asking, I'm not going to show you data, we're asking these questions in that Nebraska site that I showed you because it allows us to look deeper into the responses of CO2 in these very, very deep, less soils in Nebraska that I mentioned. This is one site obviously that we're studying, but I want you to remember that these types of soils are pretty common in areas in the Midwest. For example, this one Brady soil that we're studying the area marked by black here, but it's actually distributed and has been characterized all across Nebraska, in the southern part of Nebraska in particular, and then Kansas. And I mentioned that that layer, that black layer that was in that picture that I showed you earlier, is a layer that was deposited when the environmental conditions were drier and warmer, associated with periods of fires that occurred in the Midwest, and then wind-blown material from those fire events that was deposited in this area. And we see that accounting for these buried layers in the Brady soil alone. That Brady soil alone in that spread in the Midwest that I showed you brings in additional 675 megagrams of carbon that wasn't previously accounted for by soil carbon calculations that only characterized topsoil. Remember, these soils can go down to 6, even 30 meters in some cases. And to understand questions around variability of this buried carbon, we're now introducing the soil and adding not just water, but also exudates as a fresh source of carbon, and even nutrients such as nitrogen into the mix to see what would it take to basically activate this carbon that's been sitting in these deep buried layers in the Paleosoil for anywhere from 10 to 14,000 years, and how significant of a loss can we expect if the environmental conditions were to change significantly in areas that have these kinds of deep soil carbon stocks. And then I'll move on in my last part to just talk about this question about what do we care about this from a management perspective? And I actually think, yes, we should. To start with, I hope everybody here knows that soils store twice as much more carbon than the atmosphere and vegetation combined. And soils have been both victims of climate change and land degradation in terms of soil health or carbon storage, but they can also offer powerful solutions for carbon mitigation, climate mitigation. And part of this story of solution for carbon mitigation is associated with the ability of soil to form these mineral organic matter associations that I spoke about. So the carbon that's physically and chemically associated with carbon and can stay there for a long period of time. And I feel like it's really important to think about this pool of carbon as part of an integrated strategy to address climate change, because the way we're going, right, if you just focus on the black part, is the observed data on CO2. And these are 3 scenarios of what the future looks like as far as CO2 concentration in the atmosphere is concerned. We can either have an option to continue as business as usual, or we can engage in emission reduction strategies that slow down the rate of change. But if we were to add climate smart land management practices that can pull out CO2 from the atmosphere, then we really have a real potential to bend the curve, if you will, and get to more negative carbon neutral and even negative scenarios going forward. And a big part of that story, I think, can revolve around deep-rooted perennial systems that we know have large potential to store carbon in deep soil layers where it is preserved for long periods of time. In fact, there's been a neat compilation of the sequestration potential of different climate smart land management practices that Keith Postian and others published a couple of years ago that showed that if you focus on that blue line right here, enhanced root phenotypes. So this would be selection for plants that have extensive deep-rooted deep roots that could store large amounts of carbon below ground, can come with a sequestration for the potential of about 1 petagram CO2 equivalent per year, and it could be implemented across large areas around the world. And we are now working with a group from the Lawrence Livermore National Lab to look at multiple paired sites across the US that have annual grasses as well as switchgrass, a deep-rooted perennial energy crop that has been introduced at least for 10 years for our observations. We see that the implementation of this strategy has close to doubled the amount of carbon that's stored in soil. And we use radiocarbon evidence to show that indeed it's new carbon from switchgrass that's coming into this system. Overall, if these strategies work the way we think they can, with all sorts of different big, deep-rooted perennial systems, they have this large potential that could be implemented across many areas, including marginal areas and degraded soils, to store large amounts of carbon that can contribute to greenhouse gas mitigation. So I hope what I've done today is convince you that deep soils are really important because they store more than 50% of soil carbon, and that we're missing a big picture by not looking at deep soils, including in our global carbon accounting. And I think there's a cautionary story here also that deep soils can be active and sensitive to change in environmental conditions, and we need to pay attention to that, including in permafrost and other circumpolar systems in general. And I think deep soils and strategies that utilize deep soil for carbon sequestration also can be a really important part of the solution for climate change going forward. I thank my students and collaborators and funding sources that have allowed us to do this work. Thank you, everyone.
The role of, and this is from Tim Beach, who you'll be meeting with soon, Bill Schlesinger critiqued soil-based climate mitigation a while ago, and you certainly did talk about sequestration of carbon, of atmospheric carbon using the soil. So can you talk a little bit about the just the mitigation and maybe what Bill's critique was about?
Those who might not be aware, what Tim's referring to is one of the prominent scholars in this field, along with a couple of others, had different publications over the last few years talking about how soil carbon sequestration and its contribution to climate change mitigation is not huge. So in some ways, when we talk about it, we could be distracting away from the decarbonization that need to happen and reduced emission in the energy sector in the first place. I actually disagree with Bill and the others in this idea, because I think we're at a point where we need an all of the above kinds of efforts, where we need to decarbonize, we need to reduce emissions from the energy sector and transportation sector in general, but we also need to figure out a way forward that includes carbon sequestration in soil. And this is not just critical, it's critical, I should say, first of all, that according to global estimates and studies that have been done right now, a 0.4% increase in soil carbon sequestration globally per year could offset a third of the fossil fuel CO2 emissions. Some people hang up with the idea that maybe 0.4% per year globally is not achievable. And I personally think that that's beside the point, right? Even if we achieve 0.2%, that's still a step in the right direction. If we achieve 0.3, that's even greater. The point is, I think the important point to remember is that any amount of carbon that we are able to sequester in soil contributes to improving soil health. It contributes to even increasing the potential of soils to sequester atmospheric carbon dioxide even further. And it is also critical for food and nutritional security of the human population. So if we care about the food that we're going to eat and the sustainability of our ecosystem going forward and really our livelihoods, then we can't do away with carbon sequestration. We have to be able to pursue carbon sequestration along with decarbonization. And in fact, as that I showed you earlier suggested, that decarbonization, the way it's going right now, can only slow down the rate of increase in atmospheric CO2 concentration. We have to figure out a way to take out CO2 from the atmosphere. And soil carbon sequestration happens to be one of the most cost-effective ways and cost-effective, scalable approaches for taking out CO2 from the atmosphere. And doing so comes with a range of co-benefits that are critical for food security, for human security and human welfare, and even national security questions going forward. So I think it's, in my opinion, it's a mistake to dismiss soil as carbon sequestration as not being important, only because the magnitude might be smaller than decarbonization. Because regardless of how the number might be slightly smaller than decarbonization in the energy sector, it's still an important step we cannot ignore. And it's critical for our livelihood. It's critical for the ecosystems, for the ecosystem health that we depend on, that we do so.
Excellent. Thank you. And with that, I will pass this over to Dr. Callas. Thank you, Dr. Berhe. It was wonderful.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I'm going to end the lecture now, and I hope to see you guys next Thursday.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.